Well, first, Victoria completely stuffed up the quarantining of returning travellers and people sick with the virus. Result, the virus got out. Another 73 new infections today, and more than 300,000 people are now in lockdown today over 36 suburbs in Melbourne's north. I wonder if that lockdown's really necessary, but also, is that lockdown being as mishandled as the quarantining was? Because the Victorian government is sending teams of workers from door to door to test people and to give health warnings. But from these videos on Facebook, there's not much social distancing going on, even among the testers, and no face mask in this particular group, and only one face mask that I could count in that one. It's actually a bigger group than that. Still from the video, there's probably about 4 times more people huddled together. Now, maybe masks don't actually make a difference. I don't know. But it does seem to me odd. Joining me, Daniel Wild, Director of Research at the Institute of Public Affairs, and Jenna Clarke, Assistant Editor of the West Australian. Jenna, does it give you much confidence in how this virus is being handled in Victoria when teams of people are going together in a huddle, 10, 15 people, door to door, not a mask or one mask among all that people? I mean, that doesn't sound very confidence-inspiring to me. What about to you?
No, absolutely, Andrew. I was mortified seeing these scenes coming out of Victoria today, considering we here in Western Australia have basically eradicated the virus because we went hard and we went fast and we shut everything down to make sure that minimal people were infected with the virus. We've only got 4 active cases floating around the state at the moment, and that includes because we have tested really stringently through all of the community with the detect test. But what I cannot get over is the absolute failing of the Andrews government when overseas travellers were coming back into Victoria and there was not mandatory testing because it was uncomfortable. I cannot fathom, it is absolutely ridiculous that happened and has put the entire state at risk. I think it's absolutely deplorable and heads need to roll.
Well, not just the state at risk, of course, because other states are freaking about letting Victorians in and infecting them again. Yeah. Daniel, Jenna mentioned, the widespread testing and the government's really blitzing those 36 suburbs hard with lots and lots of tests, which makes me wonder whether shutting down those suburbs is strictly necessary. Shouldn't we go to what I've been trying to argue for months? Shut people in their homes who are sick or won't be tested, but if they've been tested and they're fine, why shut them down? And if it takes monitoring of their phones or tracking, putting tracking bracelets on people who are in home detention, do that, but just not a total lockdown because the cost is horrendous.
Yeah, it's a fair point, Andrew, and I think it gets to an issue which has really been throughout this whole coronavirus, which is we've seen a lot of blanket bans placed on activities, but really there's 2 sides to the risk equation. There are, on the one hand, the activities that are of high risk of transmitting the virus. So these are things where you're in close quarters with a large number of people indoors. And then there's the whole range of activities that were still banned that appear to be of very low risk, such as going to the beach, surfing, exercising outdoors, fishing, other such matters. So there was disproportionate risk in terms of how they went about imposing the regulations. And then, as you say, Andrew, there's the risk in terms of who can contract the virus and who does contract it, and their liability to get very sick from that. So if you target the 2 high-risk areas in terms of the activities and the people that are a high health risk, then you're going to go a long way into mitigating the negative impacts of the virus without having to disrupt people's lives to the extent that they were. But I think it just gets to a bigger failure of the Andrews government in Victoria, which is, I mentioned all those petty restrictions on the one hand, and then of course we had the thousands and thousands of protesters that went out with the permission of police and government in open violation of the law. And I think a lot of Victorians have just looked at the combination of those 2 events and lost a lot of faith in the experts, in the politicians, that these laws have been primarily targeted to the public health issue. And I think there's been a significant amount of overreach and an abuse of the privileges and powers that have come with this public health emergency.
I think that's right. Jenna, I mean, one interesting difference here, Victoria was toughest and other states also. Last time they had lockdowns statewide, they shut down schools. This time in the 36 suburbs, they're not doing that. So that's one lesson learned, that maybe the initial reaction was way over the top.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw that here in WA, Andrew, because the schools were the last things to close. Our Education Minister worked hand in glove with our Chief Medical Officer, and they were saying that schools are probably the safest place for children. They basically had a stockpile of every single detergent and hand sanitizer that was going around, and there was zero detection, because then when schools did resume, they decided to go and test around 10,000 teachers and school kids just to ensure that community spread wasn't taking part. So I think the fact that you've got to look at McGowan as a gold standard for how coronavirus as a health emergency has been handled, and Daniel Andrews has to be looked at as someone that has completely failed not only his state but the nation.
I know. On Saturday, big test for Labor leader Anthony Albanese. The voters of Eden-Monaro, there's a big seat surrounding Canberra, going to Merimbula on the coast. It's going to have a by-election. No federal government has won a seat from the opposition, this was held by the opposition, in a by-election in a century. Will Anthony Albanese be the loser of the century, Daniel Wild?
Well, it's looking that'll be the case more and more every day, Andrew. And I think the reason for that is because it comes down to policy differences and talking about issues that mainstream Australians care about. What has been the big issue that Labor has been talking about? Is it jobs? Is it small business? Is it the future of the Australian way of life? No, it's been the ABC. That's been their big campaign. The big campaign issue. Not even a cut to ABC, a freeze to their funding, up to 240 job losses over 3 years, many of which will be voluntary redundancies out of a workforce of over 4,000. When we've had widespread job losses across the country, small businesses have been decimated. And on the other hand, you've had the Prime Minister talking about issues like home ownership and jobs, which are the things that people care about now.
I'm sure Anthony Albanese has been talking about some of that too, but I thought it was weird that
it's not been a key feature. It's all been ABC.
I know. But Jenna, Albanese was today playing down the importance of any loss, lowering expectations, said the seat wasn't a natural Labor seat like Cunningham, which Labor lost in a by-election to the Greens, and that helped kill off the leadership of Simon Crean. Here he is today.
It's a tough circumstance. This is, we have the first pandemic in 100 years, and due to that, it's unknown territory. Eden-Monaro is a seat that it's not Cunningham. It's a seat that, unlike Cunningham, that's traditionally always been held by Labor. This is a seat that, on the current boundaries, would have been held by the coalition since the Whitlam government.
That seems like a man preparing for defeat there, Jenna. Am I reading too much into it?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think they're preparing for the worst, and they're going to be pleasantly surprised, praying that it's not a similar reaction that they had in May last year. But I think it's really interesting because that the switch that came around, the historic switch that came a century ago, was actually in a seat called Kalgoorlie here in Western Australia, and has it's quite similar with the Eden-Monaro seat. It's regional. It's focused purely on. It's a regional hub, and it has quite a very, very diverse electorate and things like that. And I think the one thing that will probably cut through with this election, which probably a lot of us in the media have been ignoring, is it's definitely going to be grassroots issues, as Daniel mentioned. It's going to be jobs, it's going to be how we're going to get out of this economic deficit that we're in, and ensuring that the people of Eden-Monaro are well looked after when they get through this election on Saturday.
Well, let's see. I mean, you sound like you're thinking that Labor could be in a bit of trouble. We'll see what happens, because this could be very bad for Anthony Albanese's leadership if that is indeed the case. Jenna Clarke and Daniel Wild, thank you both so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Andrew.